And hello, it's Scotland at 7. I'm Hugh Stewart. Now, tonight's main story, shortly we're going to be discussing a new opinion poll which shows 55% of Scots in favour of independence. And we're going to be discussing that and the other headlines tonight with Professor John Robertson, who joins us online from Ayr. Right, good evening, John. I hope you're keeping well today.
Good evening, I am. Yes, thank you. You too?
Thanks. So, as usual, John, we're going to go over the coronavirus update today from the Scottish Government, and then we'll have a discussion on that story and the others that we have tonight. So, first of all, the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,683,752 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,953,421 have been confirmed negative. 730,331 have tested positive. That's 730,331. There are 2,796 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will show symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 19 new reported deaths today of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,591. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 702 were in hospital last night, 54 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 4,347,880 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,951,364 have received a second dose. Also, 1,722,225 have received a third dose of their booster. The latest UK daily figures show 145,140 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness. That's an increase of 171 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. Now today, as it's a Wednesday, we have an NRS update. As of the 28th of November 2021, 12,127 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate. This is according to statistics published today by the NRS, the National Records of Scotland. In the week, the 22nd to the 28th of November, 97 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, an increase of 1 death from the previous week. 18 deaths were aged under 65, 34 were aged from 65 to 74, and there were 45 deaths in people aged 75 or over. 55 of those dying were male and 42 were female. 82 deaths were in hospitals, 6 in care homes and 9 in homes or in a non-institutional setting. The number of deaths from all cases registered in Scotland this week was 1,270, which is 140 or 12% more than the 5-year average. Okay, that's the COVID position today. And now our main story. A new poll shows that 55% of Scots back independence. A new poll published today has found that 55% of people in Scotland would back Scotland becoming an independent country if a referendum was held tomorrow. The poll conducted by Ipsos Mori for STV News shows that support for independence has increased by 5% since before the Scottish Parliament elections in May. In other findings, the poll also shows that SNP leader and First Minister Nicola Sturgeon continues to be the most popular of the party leaders in Scotland, with 58% of people saying they are satisfied with her performance. By stark contrast, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of UK, continues to be one of the least popular leaders, with 80% of people dissatisfied with the job he is doing. Commenting, SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown, MSP, said, "I welcome this extremely encouraging poll that shows the majority of people in Scotland would back Scotland choosing a better future as an independent country. However, we do not take anything for granted and will continue to make the case to the people of Scotland on how we can build a fairer, greener and more prosperous nation as an independent country. The people of Scotland, not a Tory government they didn't elect, have the right to decide their own future, and following the election in May, there is a clear, substantial majority in the Scottish Parliament for a fresh referendum once the COVID crisis has passed. So let's look at this opinion poll today. So the headline figure, John, is 55% would say yes to the standard question. So this poll asked the same question in the referendum. Should Scotland be an independent country, I think was the wording. So 55 said yes, 45% said no. So first of all, are you surprised? This seems to buck the trend of recent polls. Is there anything unusual in that?
It has. Yes, I mean, it's good news, and as you say, it's bucking a trend. I wonder if I could briefly, contrary to what I said before we came on air, there is something about the new variant that I thought I might be worth mentioning there. Um, as I understand it, and I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist, unlike the owner of a nightclub round the corner seems to often be, but I've been reading that that viruses evolve to become more infectious. They don't evolve to become more lethal. The lethality is an unfortunate consequence of what they do in the human body and the way they relate to the immune system. But they evolve to become more infectious and not more violent. And I hear somewhere, I've read it somewhere, I must admit this may be early to say, that the death rate tends to fall. That the death rate of the new virus looks to be, well, there have been no deaths from the new variant. And as I understand it, there have been less deaths with every successive variant. They spread more quickly, they're more easily caught, but they don't seem to be killing as much. And so that might mean, optimistically, we might be moving towards, from a pandemic scenario, towards an endemic one like the flu, where admittedly, the old and vulnerable may be at risk every winter, but it's not on the same scale. I thought it was an interesting point. But I'm not claiming it's fact. But returning to the opinion poll, as you say, very positive. I mean, a 10-point gap, which is almost like a reversal of the 2014 result. There are some interesting things about Ipsos Mori. I've been interested for some time. I mean, research methods was one of my areas of interest in the past, something I taught about. And methodology interests me more than the average person, and in particular sampling. I'm not sure if people are aware that Ipsos Mori have not had a majority for no since 2018. And they're the first to have a majority for yes after quite a long run of majorities for no in the other opinion polls. So there's something different happening with Ipsos Mori and the others, especially Savanta. When they report for the Scotsman, you can be fairly sure it's going to be bad news for the yes campaign. So there's something happening there. We could do with a PhD student to get into this. It might be, I mean, I've had a look and I can't see much myself. It might be that Ipsos Mori are looking at a slightly younger sample, and Savanta are maybe overdoing the elderly, who are, of course, as we know, when you look at the breakdown, only the over 65s are heavily for no now. I think it's the 55s to 65s are split down the middle, and the rest of the population, who, to be fair, have more reason to care about this, are heavily in favour of independence.
Well, John, you've covered quite a lot of it. Let's just very quickly go back to the COVID. Now, like yourself, I'm not going to express any opinion on whether the virus is going to become less lethal or not. So let's just say for a moment we hope so. But clearly we know that viruses, like any other organisms, are, if you like, programmed to survive. And they do that by jumping from you to me and to the next person in the bus queue. So it might well be, as you say, that they survive better by not killing the host. But but people better not quote me on that. It's not my area of expertise either.
But the World Health Organization has already announced that they think the reaction in the northern world, in Northern Europe, is an overreaction to the new variant. So that's already, we have the World Health Organization indicating they don't think this variant is such a risk to life as it might seem.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's hope so. So I think I'll just leave it at that point. Maybe we should have somebody on who is an epidemiologist one of these days. If you know any, let me know. I'm just going to reverse what I was going to say since you've raised that question, because let's go back to the potential for a Scottish referendum on independence, because the First Minister said, of course, the other day, COVID first, once we've dealt with COVID, I intend to put the question to the Scottish Parliament in sometime in the spring. I think no particular deadline. But and I just ask you from what you said a minute ago, John, do you think that maybe offers a sensible strategy to the Scottish Government to say, yes, we said after COVID, but in fact, there isn't really going to be a time when we are after COVID, so we'll just have to get on with it?
Yes, I mean, I fully understand why the First Minister and why the Scottish Government can't be seen to be reckless about this, and they have to. They have no choice to be political about this, to make it very clear that the lives of the population come first before constitutional change. I fully understand that. There's no reason at all, of course, given what happened with Brexit, that a government can't manage two things at the same time and manage the pandemic as the Scottish Government have objectively done better on this, regardless of any background issue with regard to the Constitution. So I still think maybe I've been accused of being naive, which is odd for somebody who was supposedly a professor, but I've been accused of being a bit naive. But I tend to trust the SNP leadership and that they will actually arrange a referendum by the end of 2023. I would have maybe liked to see it sooner, but when you look at the opinion polls, if they're at all accurate, it would have been quite high risk to go for one. And we saw from the situation in Quebec a few years back that to go for a second referendum and lose it is almost fatal, certainly for a quarter of a century or more, I would think.
Well, certainly, I think for the Scottish Government and the general Yes campaign, or most of the people in the Yes campaign, I think Quebec is a big nightmare because the second referendum in Quebec was lost. Well, the No campaign won it by a very tiny margin. Don't you probably remember how many?
Yeah.
It was literally a few thousand people. It was a couple of busloads of people who lost that vote. And as you say, John, that's it definitely off the agenda. So I can also agree with you that. I'm glad I'm not in a position of having to make that decision. Another issue on a potential referendum that comes up is about, well, let's look at, again, as you said, about the breakdown of who's for and who's against it. Certainly there's a very, very strong bias. The young people are very strongly, in fact, up to, I think, the age of 30, something like over 70% for yes. So I suppose really the crucial thing about the next referendum is whether the old people and whether people like south of Scotland are going to vote for it. I'm one of the old people, by the way, but I don't know if I'm a representative sample. So as you said, John, it's people over 60 are generally no. The other group, we had a look at the figures today, dividing the country into 8 regions, as the Ipsos Mori do. 7 out of those 8 are for 7 out of 8 are yes, and the only one that's no is south of Scotland, which of course is the area represented by Alistair Jack and David Mundell. Have you any idea what's the difference in south of Scotland compared to most of the rest of the country?
Well, I suppose these are areas with a long-term history of voting Conservative. So I suppose it's not surprising. There are also areas with a very high level of immigration from England, and of a particular kind of immigrant, of elderly, middle class, maybe people of quite high self-esteem. I was quite interested to notice that there's almost comparable immigration of people from, or maybe immigration is the wrong word, but movement of people from England into the Highlands as there is into the south of Scotland. But I'm guessing they must be a very different kind of person that chooses, because support for the Conservatives, as of course you'll realise, in the north and west of Scotland is very low, and in the borders where they have a high English population is very high. So I'm not sure I understand that entirely. I think it's just conservatism with a small C or a big one.
Well, so maybe there's an overlap then with UK Conservative politics. So it'll be interesting to see what happens then if pressure continues on the UK Prime Minister, on the various accusations of cronyism and so forth. That doesn't seem to have affected things in politics in England yet, but maybe we'll come back to the North Shropshire by-election. Of course, the one that's been occasioned by the departure from the House of Commons of Mr. Patterson. So it'd be interesting to see if there's any movement against the Conservatives there. So we'll come back to that.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think that the Conservative vote in the borders and perhaps in some other areas will survive long enough for the Tories to dump Johnson. As soon as Boris becomes, a negative for them in terms of winning elections, he will be stabbed in the back very quickly and replaced. And the Tory party will, as it does pragmatically, move back towards the centre ground. And we'll see a new David Cameron type emerge as they try to fool the electorate again. And unfortunately, in the south of England, they will fool them again.
Well, that's politics, John. So obviously we are going to come back to that question again, but it's interesting to note, remember our main story tonight, for the first time in a while, the Ipsos Mori poll has showed a majority of 55% for independence. So by the way, that poll was conducted by telephone, so that might explain their methodology. Maybe produces different results to some of the other opinion polls. Now I'm going to move on to our next story. A report out today says that UK families will lose £1,700 next year as a result of Brexit. New analysis today reveals that the average UK family will lose £1,700 in 2022 as the result of the UK's Brexit-fuelled cost of living crisis. Research conducted by the Centre for Economics and Business Research, that's the CEBR, projected that the inflation rate would rise to 4.6% by Christmas, mainly due to a rise in energy and fuel prices. The forecast is based on the price of commonly bought items, including food, clothes and household goods, as well as utility bills, including fuel, energy and transport costs. It comes at a time when the Scottish Government launches a new heating benefit initiative that will help around 400,000 low-income families with the reassurance of a guaranteed £50 payment every winter. Furthermore, the Scottish Government has also committed to doubling the Scottish Child Payment to £20 a week in order to tackle the cost of living crisis, which the SNP says was created by Westminster. So, John, cost of living is an issue not only here but in Europe. A similar inflation rate is observed throughout the Eurozone. They expect something like 4.5% inflation over the next year as well. So prices are going up. So there clearly is a cost of living squeeze everywhere. In your opinion, is it fair to blame this all on Brexit, or is it supply shortages around the world caused by COVID, or a combination of both?
Yes, you're going to regret inviting me on tonight because, again, you said something there about that opinion poll that I just can't let go, something I didn't know. I'll come back to. I mean, you're right about Brexit. But, and as you mentioned, it was a telephone poll. I didn't know that. Again, as I mentioned before, I'm very interested in methodology. And opinion polls and carried out by telephone or online tend to get slightly different responses. Telephone polls tend to get more conservative responses. You tend to have access to people who are more likely to be conservative with a small c or a big C, and also who are reluctant to embrace constitutional change. So I'm even more heartened by that news that this was a telephone poll. I think that's very encouraging. Sorry about that, but I couldn't let it go. It's maybe just an age thing. Coming back to the point about the impact of Brexit and perhaps COVID, I mean, clearly it would be stupid to suggest for a minute it was all one thing or the other. Although I find it hard to believe that it's not primarily to do with Brexit. I think I remember George Monbiot saying in 2014 that the Scots voting to stay in the Union were carrying out a piece of self-harm, essentially. And Brexit is the same. I mean, it's been one of the most remarkable pieces of self-harm that people have voted for. And we haven't seen the last of it. But the UK economy is in deep trouble, and the consumer and the average citizen is already paying for it and will continue to pay. And I sometimes think maybe that's not as much as it might be if we're going to be paying an extra £1,700. So I have only a negative view of that.
Okay, well, that's the figure, the headline figure anyway. The CEBR reckons an average family will be $1,700 a year worse off. Now, in fairness to the report, people can look at the CEBR, it's on there today. They say that, as we put it in the report, it's Brexit fueled. So some of it comes from a shortage of lorry drivers and the difficulty of getting things across the channel, which used to be quite easy. But yeah, I think you're right, John, it is a mixture. There's obviously worldwide supply problems which have been caused by COVID. But Brexit, as we've reported before, hasn't even finished yet. There's more Brexit restrictions will come in in January. So I'm quite sure we'll be discussing that again, John. Since you raised the topic, just before I move on to the next story, I'll just check. I'll just ask if my colleague can just check. I'm pretty sure that is a telephone poll, since I've realised now it's a very important topic, so we better just check. I'll
Yeah,
come back to that if you wouldn't mind looking it up. I think it is. I was looking at the different polls
yeah.
today, and of course it's
It's
important to.
unusual. Yeah,
Aye,
it's unusual. They're more expensive to do. An
mhm.
online poll is much more economical to do, and they tend to dominate now. Online polls. I mean, 20 years ago or 10 years ago, telephone polls were dominant. And there are studies that they're often very general. They might be undertaken in America or whatever, but they tend to find telephone polls will access the more conservative, sometimes the older, more effectively than online will.
Yep, yeah, see, I think that kind of makes sense. Yeah, I'll come back to that. I'll check that anyway, since you've raised that as an important methodological issue, right? So let's move on to our next topic, right? Scotland is left disadvantaged after the UK government ignores requests for a review of electricity grid access charges. And the story is that the UK government today ignored the requests from MPs to review the higher electricity grid charges for electricity producers in Scotland. Currently, it costs more for Scottish electricity producers to connect to the grid than elsewhere in the UK or across the whole of Europe. Responsibility for grid charging lies with the UK government in Westminster. Scotland currently has 25% of Europe's offshore wind capacity. However, grid charges implemented by the UK government means that Scottish wind farms are 20% more expensive than farms south of the border. Now, as an illustration, we found today that a 1 gigawatt offshore wind farm off the Scottish coast will pay £38 million a year for connection to the grid, whereas a 1 gigawatt wind farm off the southeast of England will actually receive £7 million a year. So that's a differential of 45 million. So it's a 38 million cost against a 7 million bonus. And that means close to £1 billion over a 20-year period. In the report published earlier this year, the Scottish Affairs Committee in Westminster recommended the review of the electricity grid charging system to make it fairer for all parts of the country and to enable Scotland to achieve its renewable energy ambitions to supply clean energy across the British Isles and Europe. The UK government published its response today and failed to agree to review this unfair system, commenting, SNP's Shadow Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Alan Brown MP, said, once again Scotland is being ignored by the Tories at Westminster. The sky-high grid charges aren't just hampering Scotland's renewable energy ambitions, they are impacting on energy consumers and hindering the aim of tackling climate change. SNP MPs have been making the case for months now that grid charges in Scotland need reformed, and the Scottish Affairs Committee has put forward credible and achievable recommendations and set out the evidence showing the impact of the unfair system on Scotland, but the UK government refuses even to review it. So, John, this is an issue that's been happening a long time, even when we had coal power stations. A coal generator in Cockenzie, for example, had to pay more to actually to get connected to the grid than a coal station in Yorkshire. So that's a long-standing price differential. Let's be fair here. We always try to be fair on Scotland at 7. Because the wind power is in the north and the population is down south, is it reasonable, is it rational that there should be differential connection charges?
I wouldn't say so. And you mentioned coal-fired power stations. I must admit, I didn't know that. And I for a year I worked in Long Island Power Station in Fife when I was between university and teacher training college. Um, and I remember it well. But as you say, it's a long-running sore here. It's getting a lot more media attention at the moment, although I would claim, and I've been writing about this in my blog for quite a while, and people who feed my blog, often engineers, we know all about this. It's much of the UK's relative success in achieving targets to increase its use of renewables and other environmental activities like planting trees is done on the back of Scotland. Um, you know, a huge amount of electricity is produced in Scotland by renewables and then fed south to the huge population there, which imports either from Russia in the form of gas or from Northern Europe. And so it's a huge insult, I think, when you think of it, that not only are we subsidising or helping the south of the UK to meet its targets, we're being punished for doing so. It's just astonishing. It's astonishing, but then again, maybe it's not when you consider the nature of the United Kingdom.
Well, as your opinion obviously shared by the Scottish Affairs Committee, and interestingly, of course, there's always been a Scottish Affairs Committee in Westminster, but it's only been in the last 5 years or so that it's been dominated by SNP members. So that just shows you, that maybe raises the question of what is the point of having people in there proposing motions through Westminster committees and then nothing happens. So maybe there's a wider issue there. By the way, while you were talking there, and I was listening, by the way, I've just checked on another blog. You mentioned your blog. I was looking at James Kelly's blog on opinion polls, and he did indeed say today Ipsos Mori use a telephone poll, and so he's also impressed by the change. While you mentioned it, then what's the name of your blog, John?
It's called Talking Up Scotland.
Right, so if people want to look at your arguments for what's being overlooked, maybe,
and you can search it. I've been blogging since
Yep, thank you. Okay, yes, that's worth looking at then. So I think you're maybe doing about what we're trying to do. We're saying if there's something that's not really been covered properly in the mainstream media or not covered fairly, we'll try and have another look at it. Now,
I try to use what I learned as an academic to always have sources. I understand why journalists often don't have sources. They're often working to very tight timescales. But at times, that some of the things that journalists write could do with a bit of fact checking.
Yep, that's another issue we haven't got time to go into. Now, I'm going to move on to another story today, which is actually in the papers, and it's in the BBC website. Labour brings forward a motion of no confidence in the QEUH and the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board. So this is the senior management of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Govan and the whole Greater Glasgow Health Board. So what's happened is that, well, I'll just read out the story first. There's a number of different sides to this. Senior clinicians have written a letter to the First Minister expressing their concern at the ongoing criticism of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and the Greater Glasgow Health Board. This is criticism by opposition parties and the media, which the clinicians believe is unfounded. The letter coincides with a motion today in the Scottish Parliament by Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar, who called for Parliament to declare that it has no confidence in the Greater Glasgow Health Board and calling for the board to be sacked. Incidentally, that vote was today. I don't have the numbers, but I don't suppose it passed because Labour doesn't have a majority. So if you have any numbers, you could let us know. John, do you have anything on that, John? Okay, so I've just heard that what happened in that procedure is that the Scottish Government actually proposed an amendment, and so the amendment was passed, so Anas Sarwar's poll did not go ahead. So anyway, the Ipsos Mori poll released today, the one we referred to earlier, showed that the Scottish Government was perceived as managing the Scottish NHS badly. However, the 23 senior clinicians said that they were writing to express, as they said, their immense disappointment and frustration about the way their hospitals, colleagues and the treatment of their patients was being portrayed in the press and in the Scottish Parliament. A Scottish Government amendment to the Labour motion, this is a bit I should have read earlier, a Scottish Government amendment to the Labour motion which recognised the work of frontline NHS staff at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and across the health service in the care that they have provided to patients and families throughout the COVID-19 pandemic was carried. So let me just clarify that because I confused myself there. So Labour and Anas Sarwar proposed a motion of no confidence in the management of the QEUH and the Greater Glasgow Health Board. An amendment from the government praised the staff of the above, and the amendment was passed. So that's where we are with the vote in Parliament. However, let me just go through this one stage at a time, John. So first of all, there's been a lot of criticism, mainly from Scottish Labour, on health outcomes, and that seems to have had some effect in what showed up in the Today's Opinion poll. Nicola Sturgeon high ahead in the polls, high satisfaction with the Scottish Government's COVID response, and high satisfaction for Nicola Sturgeon in general, but relatively low satisfaction for health in general. So what do you think? Is there a serious problem with the way health is managed, or is it this continuing campaign from Labour, including this no confidence in the health medics? Is Labour having some effect there?
It may be. I mean, I've always been a bit of a skeptic about media effects. It was one of the things I researched and taught about. And there aren't many media effects. You remember all the panic in the past about video games making children violent and so on. Nothing ever came out of those. I think mostly media representations don't have much effect, but I think a consistent barrage of negativity about certain areas where people might feel anxious. So obviously healthcare, education for their children, crime and punishment. Those areas, I think where the media continually represent things as problematic in Scotland, that may be affecting these polls in a worrying way. And it's clearly, it's a kind of campaign, I suppose you could argue, by the opposition parties with the mainstream media in tow and servicing them. Because the Scottish Government, and as we've seen in the opinion polls, the leader, First Minister, are very hard to land a punch on. It's clearly the most successful government in Scottish history. So the only alternative for them is to choose institutions for which they are responsible, where performance is infinitely improvable. Doesn't matter how well you run the health service, you could always do it better. It can never be perfect. Same goes for schools and policing. So that may well be the case. This particular, I try to stay cool and analytical as much as I can, but the behaviour of Scottish Labour on this particular issue is frankly disgusting. It's a cynical stunt based on the sad, the rather tragic beliefs of two mothers and one or two other relatives, but a handful of the people who go through the health service in Scotland who believe that something happened and that the hospital should be blamed. There is no objective evidence at all for any of that. There is a reference to perhaps infections having been part of the picture, but all of the people who died in Scottish hospitals died for something else. None were killed by pigeon poo fungal infections. There is no evidence of that. All we see is media coverage linking. We never see any suggestion of causing, but we see the linking of these things to each other. And I think the behaviour of Sarwar and Bailey leaves a very bad smell. It's almost as if they have groomed these two people. And as I did today on my blog, I thought, well, why don't we have some facts here rather than what these two sad people? I mean, I feel for them. It must be a most awful thing for your children to die, but to be used in that way is frankly unacceptable. Because when you have a look at the statistics, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, or the Southern General, as I prefer to remember it, when you look at its mortality, so the hospital mortality rates, then actually Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is one of the better ones. All of the Scottish hospitals, bar one, and I think it's the Western General in Edinburgh, are within the normal range. By that I mean that they predict 1 year how many people may be expected to die so that they can decide whether or not something unusual happened. Glasgow, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital had less deaths in 2020 than it had the previous year, than it was expected to have. And when you look at infection rates, and look at serious infections, and look at norovirus and so on, again, you discover the Scottish hospitals are very low level, and the Glasgow hospitals are right in the middle. There is objectively nothing wrong with the Glasgow hospitals.
Right, thank you, John. So clearly Labour has decided to position themselves here as the champion of the patient or the champion of people who have been overlooked. And so it really, are you saying that they're cynically taking on the sad cases and using that in a way that's really unfair politically and that's really not actually backed up by real evidence? Is it cynicism by the Labour Party?
There's certainly no evidence. we saw with Sarwar before this, at the same time, I suppose, and also before, the hospital discharges into care homes. We had Sarwar contradicting professionals and professional judgment and saying, based on his common sense, a dentist and a politician, saying on the basis of his common sense, it made no sense to discharge people from hospitals into care homes because that might cause infections. The evidence is not there. Several scientific studies have shown that the infections spread in care homes because of the overuse of agency staff moving between them and failures by the leadership in care homes in actually managing the infections. In fact, the BBC's chief statistician, I remember hearing him on BBC News saying there was some evidence that care homes which received people from hospitals upped the stakes in their virus, and they're dealing with these issues, and actually had lower levels of infection. It's a stunt.
No, that's interesting. I didn't know that about the analysis of the cause and effect. As you said earlier on, John, because two things happen at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean they're linked. It doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. So, yeah, that's one of the reasons we asked you on, John, is, let's see how do you look at proper evidence and how do you draw conclusions from it. So thank you for that. Now, let me just summarise on that story there, because just to quickly summarise, remember what's happening here is it looks as if some of the actual management who have been under attack for a long time have actually written to the First Minister, not complaining about the Scottish Government, but complaining about the opposition. So that's really what our story was. So I'll move on now. So thank you for that insight into research and evidence. Now, the next story, the Scottish Conservative leader Douglas Ross is being investigated by the Westminster Standards Commissioner. Yes, Douglas Ross, Scottish Conservative leader, is facing an investigation by Catherine Stone, the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, after the Scottish Tory leader had referred himself for forgetting to declare over $28,000 in earnings from his third job as a football referee, commenting. The SNP's deputy leader in Westminster, Kirsten Oswald MP, said, Douglas Ross is just the latest in a long line of Tories who find themselves up to their neck in sleaze. By failing to declare thousands of pounds from multiple side hustles and missing crucial votes in Parliament to run the line at football matches, Mr Ross is in clear breach of the rules. The irony, of course, is that it was Mr Ross who was first off the mark to demand that others resign for rule breaking, even when it was disproven, but has now become strangely reluctant to follow his own advice. It is clear that, just like every other Tory, Mr Ross believes it's one rule for him and one rule for everyone else. The Parliamentary Standards Commissioner has also begun a formal investigation into Jacob Rees-Mogg after a complaint from Labour that he failed to declare that he'd received £6 million in cheap loans from one of his companies. So let's look at the story of referee Ross, first of all. Douglas Ross, of course, is an assistant referee for the SFA. First of all, everybody knows by now that he didn't declare these earnings. Is there any credit to Mr Ross for coming forward and submitting himself to scrutiny from the Parliamentary Standards Officer?
I suspect he was warned if he didn't come forward that some of the otherwise Conservative-friendly media might have had to expose him. I don't believe for a minute that it was an absent-minded experience. I think he planned to get away with it when he discovered he couldn't, and he came forward. You have to say in his favour, these three income streams, MP, MSP, and linesman, are all PAYE, so at least he can't fiddle his tax returns. So he's not in the same league, I suppose, as some of the people in the Westminster cabinet whose brass necks can be seen shining from here. So yeah, I mean, it's good to see. He's nothing much will come of it. I do notice that, and again, the opinion poll we spoke about, he has managed to lead the Conservative Party down to 19%. In that opinion poll, they were generally above 20%, and so that's maybe some indication of the low esteem he's held in by potential voters here. I did a quick survey a few years ago, or quite recently, of the Conservative leaders in Scotland and their opinion poll returns to see how well they were doing, and I was somewhat shocked to discover that the most successful Scottish Conservative leader in recent years was Jackson Carlow and not one of the others.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so and he was, of course, invited to resign his position because Mr. Ross was a bright young thing. So I wonder how long he'll stay in that post. It doesn't seem to be one that people stay in for a very long time. Anyway, we better move on. John, overseas news now. There's a U.S. Supreme Court abortion rights challenge. Now, the the U.S. Supreme Court has today begun hearing arguments in a case on whether to remove women's abortion rights in America, as it considers Mississippi's bid to overturn the landmark Roe v. Wade ruling from 1973, which legalized that procedure nationwide. The Supreme Court, which is a 6-3 Conservative majority, is hearing at least 70 minutes of oral arguments in the Southern States' appeal to revive its ban on abortion starting at 15 weeks of pregnancy. Lower courts blocked the Republican-backed law. Jackson Women's Health Organization, the only abortion clinic in Mississippi, challenged the law and has the support of President Joe Biden's administration. A ruling is expected by the end of June. Roe Wade recognized that the right to personal privacy under the US Constitution protects a woman's ability to terminate her pregnancy. The Supreme Court, in a 1992 ruling called Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania and Casey, reaffirmed abortion rights and prohibited laws imposing an undue burden on abortion access. Liberal Justice Stephen Breyer quoted from the Supreme Court Casey's ruling, which stated that the court should not bow to political pressure in overturning Roe Wade, and that such a ruling would subvert the court's legitimacy. The right of a woman to choose the right to control her own body has been clearly set since Casey and never challenged. You want us to reject that line of viability and adopt something different, the Liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor said. Sotomayor went on to say that Mississippi brought its new challenge purely because of changes on the Supreme Court, which had become more conservative. So there's a couple of different strands to this one, of course. First of all, that brings us back to the Donald Trump administration and his enthusiasm, his urgency with which he put conservative judges on the Supreme Court. And we've also got this attempt by Mississippi and other southern states to limit women's abortion rights. So do you think the Constitution will win here? This is one of those cases, isn't it, John, where we seem to have the federal government pitting itself against one of the southern states, or vice versa, the southern states saying we're more important than federal law. How do you think this will come out?
It's quite shocking to hear, after 50 years later, this attempt to drag the state back 50 years into the past. I have to say, I mean, this is maybe slightly tangential, that if Johnny Cash was to write the song again, I don't suppose he'd be going to Jackson anymore. But I find it shocking, and I think it reminds us that the US is not at all homogenous. There are parts of the US, including the states, some of the states in the South, which, in terms of their life expectancy and overall health, in terms of the modernity of their thinking about life, which are positively late medieval in some ways, and then you contrast that with New York State and with New England, and it's like Northern Europe. It's an astonishing country, and there's a long running struggle between the states, especially the more conservative ones, and the feds, as they say. I just find that just astonishing and deeply disappointing. I mean, the misogyny that runs through that, as we do our best to deal with misogyny in Northern Europe, to see what's happening in places that are supposedly part of the world's leading democracy.
Yes, it's in Europe too. Yeah, there's also movements to maybe roll back in Europe, in places like Hungary and Poland, roll back some of the more progressive legislation that's happened in recent years. So again, John, as I often say, I'm sure we'll come back to that story because that Supreme Court hearing is just beginning. Thank you, John. So I'm going to move on to the next story very quickly, because looking at the clock here. So back to Europe, NATO says Russia would pay a high price for Ukraine aggression. Today we've heard that NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg warned Russia not to use force against its neighbour Ukraine, saying that Moscow knows it would pay a high price through sanctions and other steps by the West for any aggression. Ukraine, a former Soviet republic that now aspires to join the European Union and NATO, has become the main flashpoint between Russia and the West, as relations have soured to their worst level in 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. Russia says it has no intention of invading Ukraine. The NATO chief said fresh economic sanctions on Russia, which the EU and the United States, along with Britain and Canada, could impose, were one powerful tool. President Vladimir Putin has said that Russia would be forced to act if the US or NATO placed missiles in Ukraine, which could strike Moscow within minutes. Stoltenberg said it was public knowledge that allies provide military support to Ukraine and that this was defensive and in line with all allies' international obligations. Ukraine is considered a close partner of NATO, but is not yet a member of the 30-nation Western Alliance. Stoltenberg rejected accusations the alliance was provoking Moscow with military exercises in the Black Sea and blamed Russia in turn for having used military drills as a disguise for attacking neighbouring countries. So, John, how nervous does it make you feel to hear of, on the one hand, we have Lukashenko doing military exercises by the Polish border, and on the other hand, NATO doing exercises in Ukraine. Are you feeling happy and relaxed about the situation in Eastern Europe?
No, it seems a bit stupid to my mind that NATO should be pushing themselves into Ukraine with such enthusiasm. It reminds you very much of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Imagine how the Americans would feel were something to happen like this very close to them. I'm reassured by the fact that NATO is not waving a sabre, that they're waving maybe is it a checkbook or something, and we're talking about economic sanctions, and certainly the countries who are members of NATO, particularly the EU, can impose quite damaging sanctions on Russia. I don't suppose the Putin regime will be much bothered about that. I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm not in a position. I'm not, just as I wasn't a virologist. I'm not an expert on strategic warfare or conflict at all. It looks like it might just be posturing, and it's understandable that the Russians would be posturing when NATO is pushing itself so obviously, and when we've seen the same in the Baltic region. So.
Okay, yes, so there's obviously some kind of a tit for tat going on. It's a kind of a balance of threats, really, so let's hope it just stays at the level of threats. But certainly Vladimir Volensky reported a week ago he believed there was a coup plot organised by Russians against him in Ukraine. So this kind of talking war has been building up for some time, so let's hope it just stays at the level of talking. So again, because of course Ukraine does want to join the EU, so that's again an issue, situation we can watch as it develops. Now let's move on to the next story of back to Scotland of a new winter heating benefit. A consultation has been launched on a new heating benefit that will give around 400,000 low-income households the reassurance of a guaranteed £50 payment every winter. The low-income winter heating assistance will be introduced from the winter of 22 to replace the current UK government cold weather payment scheme. The current UK government benefit triggers a £25 payment only when temperatures are recorded or forecast at below 0 degrees Celsius for 7 days in a row. The replacement low-income winter heating assistance benefit from the Scottish Government will provide financial stability no matter the weather. Social Security Minister Ben McPherson said, low-income winter heating assistance will be an investment of around £20 million every year to reliably support people towards the cost of heating their homes, irrespective of the weather, temperature or where they live in Scotland. Our proposed new benefit will be the equivalent of 2 payments of the cold weather payment and should ensure that most people will be better off. Significantly, it will also enable us to provide assistance to more households that are at the risk of fuel poverty. Okay, so there seems to be a bit of meddling, the tinkering, if you like, with the kind of trigger points. At what point is it cold enough to bring in a low fuel payment scheme? And there seems to be some. I looked earlier on some suggestion that with global warming, it might be cold, but not cold enough to get the winter payment. So, is it necessary then to completely recalibrate how the system is calculated? Uh,
Yes. I think simplifying benefits is always a good move. If you make benefits complicated, then you need masses of admin staff, and you end up with confusion as to who or who shouldn't get it. So it does sound like a good move to simplify it in that way, and it's good news in the wake of the doubling of the child benefit, which the Joseph Rowntree Foundation indicated when it was at the lower level was having quite a significant effect on levels of poverty in Scotland, by contrast with other parts of the UK, especially child poverty. So it's one of a there are limits with the devolution settlement places quite severe limits on what the Scottish government can do, but they keep nibbling away at things. They compensate for the bedroom tax. There are various other small benefits that they have put in place, making Scotland a slightly better place for the poor. And hopefully, with full independence, more can be done with that.
yes, on that point, John, I have noticed that looking into poverty incidents, it used to be a lot worse in Scotland 20 years ago. It used to be worse, comparatively speaking, with England. But 20 years of devolution means that the worst poverty areas are not in Scotland any longer. They are in England. Is that correct? I've read statistics along those
That's
lines.
Yes, I think the 20 worst areas in terms of poverty in the UK are in England and Wales. They're not in Scotland. So there have been achievements. And to be fair, the devolution, not just the presence of the SNP government, but devolution from the beginning under New Labour,
Yeah.
did actually have some achievements there. And while I've got many things to say against Tony Blair, he and his government did actually reduce poverty.
Yep, yep. Okay, thanks. So, thank you for that insight, John. So, I'm going to move on to another story, and this is about delivering faster internet for the regions of Scotland. A national voucher scheme helping people access superfast broadband is being extended by 3 months. Homes and businesses in Scotland who are unable to access fast internet speeds now have until the 31st of March 2022 to apply for funding worth up to £400 under the R100, that's the Reaching 100% Scottish Broadband Voucher Scheme. An additional £250 is available for those in the hardest to reach areas. The vouchers can be used to boost broadband speeds by accessing technologies such as those using satellites, mobile or wireless solutions. These are an interim measure pending the completion of the Scottish Government's programme to deliver superfast speeds by installing permanent broadband connections in the areas where the work is not viable for the commercial providers. Economy Secretary Kate Forbes said, "The pandemic has reinforced the necessity for everyone to have access to fast, reliable broadband, whether for work, business or their personal use. We will make sure everyone, regardless of where they live, has access to an acceptable level of connectivity so they can be part of the digital world. Extending the voucher scheme will help ensure no one is excluded while we continue to roll out superfast broadband solutions across Scotland." Okay, so John, the issue is here. Now, I must admit, I didn't know this. I know that some parts of rural Scotland have a very hard time getting fast broadband, of course, and that's obviously curtains if you're trying to run a small business in one of the islands. But I didn't know that you could actually just get a voucher to hook yourself up to a satellite, which of course is immensely expensive. So I've no idea if £400 is enough, but that's what they're saying. In the meantime, if you haven't got broadband in your area, go on a satellite and we'll pay you for it. So it's a stopgap. So have you, just before you go, have you an idea if £400 is enough if you're using satellite broadband 24 hours a day?
Yeah, I have no idea, I must admit. You bear in mind my age here. I've not been keeping up to date with all of these developments, but it is clearly an important area of inequality is access to the internet. And as Kate Forbes has pointed out, the pandemic has hammered home with some force the importance of people's access, because it's becoming very much part of people's jobs. I think we'll look back in a few decades and see the pandemic as one of the most significant events in history. Certainly, perhaps not since the Black Death, but certainly in recent times, one of the most, and it changing the way we live and the way we work. So hugely important.
Yes, certainly there's probably an irreversible shift towards home working since the pandemic, although, of course, people who have city centre offices are saying get back to work. But I've heard a lot of people saying I'm going in 3 days, staying at home 2 days. So it looks like people are not going to be going back permanently to commuting. So, yes, as you say, we do have to have broadband available for everybody. Although I suppose the kind of people I'm talking about, commuters, they've probably already got broadband. So it's all about to me, it's all about the price of. When I was reading this today, John, I was remembering about the price of a postage stamp. A postage stamp, I think, is the most socialist measure ever taken. One price for everyone, whether you live in London or Manchester or Glasgow, whether you live in Foyers by Loch Ness, you pay the same price. I think in the internet pricing is a bit like that. Obviously, the people who get it are those where it's cheapest, and the people who don't get it are those where it's most expensive. So I've never heard of any idea that internet access should be the same price for everyone as like a postage stamp. So we were more advanced maybe in 1600 whenever the stamps came in. But is this a case where the government really has to step in? Clearly, private providers are not going to make money providing fast broadband to South Uist, right? So does the government have to do it?
No. Well, I think that's it. You're right. I mean, the people make much of the vibrancy of capitalism, and we saw Boris Johnson claiming that the vaccines were the product of capitalism when they were actually the product of state-funded higher education research groups. So I don't think there's any doubt about that, because there's only one way of evening things out so that there's some kind of fairness in the system. There's no alternative to government investment to do that. It's reserved to the UK government at the moment, but as I understand it, there's some confusion, and the Scottish government has intervened at times to try and help out.
Yeah, and there's also an issue about whether it's the Scottish Government responsibility or a UK government. Again, there's one of these disputes there about, well, how much can the Scottish Government actually do? So this is, as I said, a stopgap measure. At least if you can't get fast broadband from your local provider, at least there's some money there. So if people didn't know that, if people who don't have fast broadband, at least there is some money there to allow you to access these more expensive ones. But I'm afraid I don't know when we're targeting rollout of proper broadband over the whole country. So we'll let you know whenever we hear about that. So, John, we're just about finished today's news. So let me just remind people, today is World AIDS Day. So on this day, we remember those people who have succumbed to AIDS. And also with the coronavirus and the discussions I had with John earlier on about vaccine rollouts and new variations, it's also maybe a time to reflect on the difficulties that science had in trying to get to grips with AIDS, work out what it was, and eventually work out the kind of treatments that are now available. But it took a long time to get there, didn't it? It took a very long time before people were able to say this is not a death sentence. So World AIDS Day today, and let's think of all those we have lost. I'm sure everyone knows someone who succumbed to AIDS. Now, just finally, before we conclude tonight, two things. A reminder that if you missed us last night, we put on a special St Andrew's Day night down in the dungeon below the studios here in Broadcasting Scotland. We had an hour of music from myself and from Mags, the fiddle player from the band Celtic Highway, and also a little talk on Who Won St Andrews from Professor Murray Pittock. So if you missed that, it's still available on our website, so have a look at the Broadcasting Scotland main website, and all of our programmes will be archived on there. And that brings me to the question of funding. We are very keen to put on more music and a wider diet of programmes on Broadcasting Scotland, and with your help we're going to do that. That's the first of the music broadcasts we're planning, and we're going to do as many as we can, really. And so thank you for helping if you are one of our subscribers. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please click on that button in YouTube. And of course, if you can help financially, that's great. Every pound we get in helps us to make more programmes. And we, as I mentioned the other night, we do in fact have plans to do regular live music, not only in the studio, but also out. We're intending to get out and about and maybe meet some of you and maybe put on some local ceilidhs. So we've got lots of plans, and the more money we get in, the quicker we'll go on with that. So thank you. I'm going to just finally say thanks to John. It's good to see you again. It's always interesting to have your insights, John. So thank you for joining me tonight.
It was a pleasure. Can I just very quickly say, buy Murray Pittock's book on the Jacobites, which explains that it was much more a pro-independence movement than it's been portrayed.
Well, I'll have a look at that. Thank you for the tip again. Okay, so that's it for Broadcasting Scotland tonight. So join us again tomorrow for Scotland at 7. So from me and John, good night. Thank you. Bye.